I'm just kidding. So I assume everybody can hear me. Welcome, everybody. And today's webinar is on choosing the right reserve study and what does adequacy mean for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so you can all see the presentation. I'm going to jump right into it. I will tell you that there's a lot of information here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in either in the chat room or just feel free to unmute yourself and jump in to ask any questions. But here we go. I will also tell you, which is on one of the first slides. Can everybody see this now? You can see the presentation. Can you guys see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my name is Mitch Frumkin. I'll tell you who I am in a second, but I think I know most of you. And what I'm going to be discussing, what does a reserve study include? What are the types of studies and which do you need? What's new with the standards, because the standards have changed and how they affect you. The relationship between reserves, maintenance, and structural adequacy. What does adequacy mean? Because that's a big question that comes up all the time. And I put down here advanced level because today, when I put together this presentation, I did skip a lot of the basics because I'm assuming that people here know what a reserve study is, know some of the terminology I'm going to use. So it's kind of on the advanced level or upper medium level or whatever you want to call it. So don't be shy about asking any questions. And also, everybody will get a copy of this presentation when we're done. If you think it's any good or you want to share it or rip it up, whatever you like. But this is more on the higher end in terms of reserve studies and what I'm going to be talking about. As far as my background, very involved in CAI with the development of the reserve study standards. When the standards were originally developed on a national basis, that goes back, I think, about 10 years at least now. I co-chaired the national task force that developed those standards. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even 5, 6 or 7 years ago, CAI wanted to update those standards to reflect feedback we got from the industry and things like that. So they asked me to co-chair the national task force, which updated the standards, which I did. Just in the last few years, due to the collapse of Champlain Towers in Florida, which everybody I'm sure is aware of at this time, that had a significant impact on our industry in regard to reserves, maintenance, structural integrity inspections, and all kinds of things. So CAI very proactively did a great thing and said, we're going to update the reserve study standards again to take into account a direct connection between reserves and preventive maintenance, as well as structural integrity inspections. So they asked me and my few buddies from across the country who've been involved in this for many years, Robert Norland from California, Bob Browning from California, and Peter Miller from Annapolis, Maryland, to co-chair a national task force that included about 15 other people on it to update the standards. Were just recently released at the national conference in Dallas about a month or so ago. So I'm going to touch on that because it does impact you. And I'm going to talk about that. And I was very involved in that. There's a book put out by CAI, their gap report on reserve funding and investment strategies, which I'm the author of, which is actually being updated right now to reflect all the new standards. I was involved in the development of the best practices on reserve studies. You're more than I can send you all a copy of that also, which is also in the process of being updated. And I'm also going to touch on, there's a fair amount of legislative things going on in regard to reserve studies. And based on some of the things that have happened, I think most of you guys are from New Jersey. So I'm going to touch on what legislatively is going on in New Jersey in regards to that. I'm on the CAI New Jersey Legislative Action Committee that's working with Senator Singleton on Senate Bill number 2760, which includes certain things specifically related to reserve funding and adequacy and things like that, that are very specific and related to the state of New Jersey. There's also other states that are doing that. For example, Delaware is looking at reserves, and a lot of states, which I'll touch on also. But there's a lot of things going on. So this presentation is kind of timely because it's essentially budget season. And, so again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. It looks like we're up to 18 now. So there's still another 30 people that will be signing in soon. So what is a reserve study? I mean, the basic concept of reserves has not changed. that it's a budget planning tool. And you notice that I underline budget planning tool because it is a budget. It's not meant to be anything more than a budget that identifies the components that a community association is responsible to maintain or replace, the current status of the reserve fund, and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the future major common area expenditures. So that's what it is. Now, if you look to the right here, that's what the new reserve study standards look like. And if anybody would like a copy, we'd be happy to share a copy of those with you also. But this definition comes directly out of there, although you will see as part of this presentation that there's been an addition to that in terms of the wording, another paragraph, which I'll touch on, which is a change. So that is a reserve study. But before we get into the details of some of the things, I just want to make sure we're all in the same wavelength in terms of what they look like. And there's two parts of a reserve study, which I think you all know. It's the physical analysis and the financial analysis. Now, this picture that you're looking at is what one of our studies looks like. But keep in mind that what I'm showing you here should be included in every reserve study based on the standards. They may look slightly different, but the information is the same. So just starting from left to right, this is the physical analysis. It's in the left-hand column, it says component. That's the common element to be funded, which is a common element component that will require replacement. Then we go from left to right. Now go to the bottom. It says the quantity of the component, how much of it is there. The next is the unit cost of the component. And then the next is the replacement cost, which is essentially the quantity times the unit cost. You come up with a replacement cost. I also notice here that where it says funds previously collected, it's pointing to the wrong column. It should be pointing to the beginning balance column. But so you've got the component, the quantity, and the replacement cost. And then most communities have already set aside money. So that falls into that beginning balance column where it's the total amount you've collected so far, distributed on a weighting average to each of the different components. Then the next column is the estimated useful life. So if it has a full useful life of 30, 40 years, 50 years, whatever it is, that's what this column is. And I will tell you that that definition changes based on the relationship to preventive maintenance, which I'll touch on in a second, which was not in the prior standards, but it definitely has an impact. The next is the estimating remaining useful life, where it's how much life is left in that component. And it's done in a few different ways. The most popular way, the most common way is you go out and look at it, see the condition, and establish how much longer it's going to last. But I'll touch on that also. Then the next column is reserve requirement. What your reserve requirement is minus the beginning balance. So if it's going to cost $100,000 to replace something, and you've already set aside $10,000, which is that beginning balance, and then you divide that amount by the number of years remaining. And again, I'm going pretty quick because I think you all know this stuff. That comes up with the reserve requirement, funding requirements, which is how much you should be setting aside each year, essentially, for that one component. Then the full funding balance. Full funding, and I'll talk about it in detail, but full funding is a certain definition, and that's how much you would have set aside if you were fully funding that component. Don't get misled in terms of thinking that fully funding is the way you should do it, because generally the trick comment is full funding is generally overfunding. But this is used as a measure of the strength of your reserve study, so it's called the full funding balance. And the last one is the fund status, which is essentially if you should have set aside, as one example, $80,000 towards all your components, and you've only set aside $40,000, then your fund status would be 50%, which means you've set aside only 50% of the full funding amount, which still may be adequate. So there's a lot of tricky things going on here, but I think the people in the audience understand what I'm saying, but I will touch on that. So this is what the physical analysis looks like. Now, this is the financial analysis, which is the other part of the study. It's a cash flow projection, which generally, it has 3 or 4 lines on it. And I'm going to show you what they are, but what you're pointing at is the bottom axis, where my pointer is years. The vertical axis is dollars. So if you start over here all the way in the beginning, this is today, right here, that's today. So how much do you have in your funds now? That's this number. Then what you're doing is you're collecting funds over a period of time. And each time this line drops down, like this spot here, it means you're replacing something. So this is what it looks like over a 30-year projection period. The national standards used to say a minimum of 20-year projection. It's been changed. It's a 30-year projection, minimum of 30 years. So that's the new standard, but I don't think anybody ever really used the 20-year standard as a minimum, but we all used 30, but now it specifically says it should be 30. So there's a few different funding plans shown in the financial analysis. And again, I think this everybody here knows it. The top line, this blue one, is what's known as full funding. Is you add everything together based on the financial analysis, the fiscal analysis, you add them all together, and this is what it looks like. You see right here at this point where it goes down to its low point, why full funding can be more than adequate, because over this 30-year period, you never run into a deficit. You never even come close to zero. So on a full funding evaluation, generally you're overfunded. On the opposite end of the spectrum is you take the annual contributions for the full funding and you just reduce them to the point where they go down to zero. So in this case, it drops down to zero. You see the green line drops down to zero. That's known as baseline funding. And there's a definition of adequacy that's been in everybody's mind for many, many, many years, that anytime your baseline funding or above, you're adequately funded because you never drop below zero. I'm going to touch on that today because there's a different theory in regards to this these days in terms of the standards. But theoretically, baseline funding is adequate funding because you never need to borrow money, you never have special assessments, all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to touch on that. So let's not think that baseline funding is the definition of adequacy anymore. Now you have the yellow line or the orange line. The orange line is somewhere between baseline funding and full funding, and that's known as threshold funding. When we talk about adequacy for your communities, you're going to establish a threshold funding model for yourself. And you see this comes down close to zero. It's closer to zero than full funding, but it's not all the way down to zero. So the definition of adequacy for your community is based on typically what threshold funding low point you go to or you're allowed to go to. That's based on a number of different variables, but which I'll touch on. And I will tell you, even in advance, I'm not going to tell you for you what is adequate funding because it changes for every association based on risk factors and a number of other things, which I'll touch on. Now, the red line is probably the most interesting line because when we do reserve studies and we do our financial analysis, we always show the red line. The red line means if you continue to fund the way you're going, what will happen? I would say in 50% of the cases, at least, if you continue to fund the way you're funding now, see what happens? You drop below zero. You're not adequately funded. So this is a very important graph when you're reviewing it because graphically it pops out at you as an association that you have a problem if this drops below zero and you need to make some adjustments to how you fund your reserves. So this is a financial analysis. The other is a physical analysis. And I want to touch on that in the beginning because a number of things I'm going to talk on going forward have to relate back to that. But I'm pretty sure, knowing the audience, that most of you guys understand these conceptual things to begin with. So now, what are the levels of service? What types of reserve studies are there? Because this is going to lead into what type of reserve studies should you have done. All right, so let's start with, and this, by the way, this is taken directly from the updated standards, and they pretty much match the old standards with a couple of variations, which I'll talk about. But a level one is known as a full study. A full study means that all 5 of the tasks of a reserve study are done. And when I say all 5 tasks, it goes back to the physical and the financial analysis. You're going to do a component inventory. You're going to figure out which components to include and the quantity of those components. So the roadways, 500 square yards. You're going to do a condition assessment, which means you're going to go out and look at it to determine how much life is left based on its condition. You're going to establish the life and valuation estimates. For example, how long will it live and how much will it cost to replace? And it's going to include a funding plan. I'll jump to that. I showed you the 3 different types of funding plans: baseline, threshold, full funding. It's going to include a funding plan and it's going to include a fund status. Again, the fund status is generally a percentage of how much you're setting aside versus full funding, just to give you a sense of scale. But again, I'll keep repeating it. Full funding in many instances is overfunding. So this is a level 1 study. It includes everything. Now let's talk about what's a level 2 study. It's an update with a site visit or on-site review. I use those words because they come directly from the national standards, the words. So it's a level 2 update with a site visit. So what you're essentially doing is taking another study that was done by the same firm or somebody else and updating it. Now, there's been some very specific changes made to that based on the new standards. So I say in here 4+ tasks are performed. It used to be just 4 tasks, and I'll tell you what the plus is in a second. So I'm going to skip the first one. You're doing a condition assessment, and because you're going out to the site, you're assessing the condition, and you're establishing the next line, the life and valuation estimates. You're doing a fund status, and you're doing a funding plan. So that stays the same. The thing that changes is the component inventory, because it used to essentially say, or it did say, that you're taking an old study, you're using all the quantities and the components as is, and you're just updating them. Now it's changed. When you do a component inventory, you're not redoing all the quantities, but you are doing some spot checks of some of the quantities to make sure they're right. So for example, some of the larger components like paving or roofing, or in a high rise, maybe the mechanical equipment, you're checking, see it says, these are the words from the standard. This does not require quantities to be reestablished, but it does require a review for general conformance of the quantities in the study being updated to reflect the as-built conditions. Before, like I said, you just took it for granted that they were right. Now you got to double check a few of them. The other thing it says is, it used to be you're just updating the components from the other study. Now it's very specific, and I'll talk about it in a little more detail going later, but components are to be added that were not previously included within the study being updated. So you just took all the components for granted and said, that's all you have. So it used to be that there was what's called the 30-year rule. And again, I'm giving you some terms that I think a lot of you know, but the 30-year rule was that you included in the reserve study any component of your common elements that will require replacement within 30 years of the date of the study. Okay, so if you have a new study, you go out 30 years. If you're updating the study after 10 years, you would now go out 40 years. But the original standards that were just, the standards did not say you have to add anything. Now it's very specific that if there's now anything that falls within that 30-year window that wasn't on the study that you're updating, they need to be added. So what was happening is there was a big omission in a lot of studies that were being done because these things were not being added. We were just updating the old study. I will tell you in my firm, from a business perspective, what we did for many, many years is we would say, we're going to update it per the national standards and just update the prior study. But if you want us to include these additional components and we have to measure them and quantify them and all these kind of things, that there would be an additional fee for doing it, because obviously it's a competitive business. So, but now the standards specifically require that they should be added. The other thing is long life components need to be recognized, and I'll touch on that. The 30-year rule is gone. It used to be that the only components you included were those that have a 30-year life or less. That has now changed. That 30-year rule is gone, which I'll touch on. Keep in mind, there's two different things I'm talking about, including components that fall within that 30-year window, one thing, but now it also would say only include components with a 30-year useful life or less. Now you may include something that has a 40-year life or a 50-year life in the initial study and then the updates, which I'll touch on because these are some critical changes in the way studies are done. And I'm going to tell you how they impact your study and some of the ways you can do it. But in the red box here, this is the change. The other next type of study is a level 3. A level 3 study is an update without a site visit, essentially. So there's only 3 tasks that are performed. You're not going out to the site to do a component inventory. You're not confirming any quantities. You're not doing a condition assessment. All you're doing is updating the replacement cost, the life based on just subtracting the number of years since it was last done. So if something had a 10-year life and the reserve study was updated 2 years ago, this is another term is paper update. When this type of update's done, all we're doing is reducing the remaining useful life by 2 years since the last study is done, even though if you go out in the field and look at it, you may need to have a 3-year reduction, a 4-year reduction, or maybe an increase in the useful life. That's not being done. You still do the funding plan and the fund status. The reserve study update is generally done rarely. It's rarely. The times we get involved in doing them, and when most communities doing them, they'll come to me and say, we want to add a tennis court. How's that going to impact us from a reserve funding perspective? So we'll do a paper update, as we call it. Or they may say, this happens a lot. We need to replace our roofs, but we don't know if we have enough money to do it. Take a look at our reserve study, do this type of update to see if we have the funding available to replace our roofs. So there's a few different times this is used from a budgetary perspective, but it's not to be used on an ongoing basis because you're not going out in the field to actually look at what things look like. So that's a level 3 update. The last one, this just was added to the standards in the last update. It's what's called a preliminary study. It's a study that's done before the communities have been built. This is something that's used by developers because in a lot of states, there's a statutory requirement that when a developer creates a new community, that they have to include in the budget reserve funding. So what's done is you do a reserve study based on the design drawings, the architectural and the engineering drawings, because nothing is built yet. So there's only 3 tasks that are performed. It's a component inventory based on the governing documents that tell you what the common elements are. It's a life and valuation estimate. Keep in mind that the remaining life and the full life are the same. So if it has a 20-year life, it has a 20-year life because it hasn't been built yet, and it includes a funding plan. In most cases, even if the statutory requirements do not require full funding, most developers use full funding. For example, the state of New Jersey, the governing documents require this type of budget. It says, and I'll get into that in a second, but in a little later, but it says in New Jersey that the developer has to provide for adequate funding. And it defines, to be quite honest, it defines adequate funding as baseline funding. But most developers use full funding anyway because there are different things that happen during construction. Things are built at different times. That things may change slightly during construction. So for a conservative approach, most developers, if not all developers, use the full funding model in their governing documents. So these are the types of level of service. So level of service, what do you choose? What do you guys choose? Now, the full study, generally at transition, it's done because a full study is done to reflect the as-built conditions as opposed to what the conditions are in the design drawings. I will tell you, most of you guys are from New Jersey. The statutory requirements now say that the developer needs to update the reserve study at the completion of construction to reflect the as-built conditions. But it's generally done at transition. And I also put here a full study may be done as when there's a loss of confidence in the study they're using. For example, we'll get a phone call, somebody will say, we just got one yesterday, we'd like a proposal to do a full reserve study, but our community is 15 years old. So I say, who do you use? What have you been using for reserve study in the past? And they'll say, we're using a study done by so-and-so, but we've lost confidence in it for whatever reason. My response is that doesn't mean you have to go to a full study because you lost confidence. Let me take a look at what you have, because in most cases, there's stuff in that study we can use so you don't have to reinvent it. So there's something between a full study and an update. And I would say as communities get older, you don't need to redo a full study. There's always something in the study that you're going to be updating that can be used to reduce the cost and to still be used. So an update with a site visit, that's a full study, loss of confidence. Now there's the update with the site visit. What the standards say is that they should be updated a maximum of every 5 years. But the best practice is to update your reserve study, including a field visit, every 3 years. There are a number of variables that's dependent on. If there's changes to the components, if a component's been replaced, then you should update it when that happens to reflect new components. If you're using a funding plan that's baseline funding, you're going down to 0. It's very critical that I would say you update it probably every year. And there's other variables that come into effect also, which I'm going to touch on. So these are the different levels and how you come to a conclusion on what you're going to use. Update with no site visit, I talked about a budgetary only, and a preliminary is budgetary by the developer. That's how it's used. So what are some of the recent changes and how does it affect the studies? You see, I told you the definition is reserve study is a budget planning tool. I put in italics because that hasn't changed. But now it says that the reserve study is a limited evaluation is conducted for budget and cash flow purposes. Tasks outside the scope of the reserve study include, but are not limited to, design review, construction evaluation, intrusive or destructive testing, preventive maintenance plan, and structural or safety evaluations. These things are not included in a reserve study. It's a budgetary tool. And the designation to do reserve studies in this country pretty much is what's known as an RS, a reserve specialist designation. More than 50% of those who have the RS designation are not engineers. They're not engineers, so they can't take it to the level that you may have an expectation for. So you have to keep in mind that this is a budgetary tool. The effect on the reserve study is that there are additional disclosures required, which I'll touch on, and the result could be an increase in funding because there's some of the things I'm going to talk about also. But that's the change to the definition of a reserve study. Next is people have the perception that the reserve study includes a structure. Very simple. The reserve study does not include the structure of the building. It's not included. It doesn't. The new reserve study standards require that there are certain disclosures in regard to that, and it could result in an increase in funding, but the disclosure is for certain types of buildings based on the public policy of CAI. It requires structural integrity inspections on a periodic basis. The cost of those structural inspections, if necessary, should be included within the reserve study. If you want me to tell you what type of buildings require structural inspections, I'm guessing that if it's a high rise, yes. If it's made out of concrete, reinforced concrete structural steel, yes. If it's stick framed, wood frame construction, no. It doesn't require structural inspection, so you don't need to include that. But there are different things that are going on that should be included in the reserve study that weren't before, such as the cost of the structural inspections, the integrity inspections. The component inventory selection process has changed. Clearly, the association has the obligation to maintain or replace it, common elements included. The need and schedule for the project can be reasonably anticipated. The 30-year rule is gone. If there's something that you can reasonably anticipate will require replacement, such as, I'll pick out vinyl siding. Vinyl siding, let's say it has a 40 to 50-year life. Past the 30-year life, but you can reasonably be anticipated, that should be included. The long life component, which I'll get to in a second, then I can see that you see that that could have an impact on your study in a couple of different ways. The total cost for the project is material and can be reasonably estimated, includes direct and related costs. So again, it goes back to long life components, but it's not just the replacement cost. For example, if we're doing, including in the reserve study, the cost of replacing the roofs, it should include in there the cost of the engineering oversight for the job, possibly an estimate for building permits and other things. So it should include the soft cost of doing things. In certain cases where you have to do inspections of your, let's say you have a fire protection sprinkler system, and it requires an inspection every 2 years. The soft cost of that inspection can be included in the reserve study. So there's some changes in this. It used to be a 4-part rule. Now it's a 3-part rule. But what does it happen? I talked about the 30-year rule. It's gone. So what are the options? You know, you're sitting there and saying, I have to now include everything that, even if it's just more than 30 years, that can make a big bump in my reserve funding amount. So there's a few different ways to do it. There are a few different options. The first is inclusion of all the long life components with the funding in the study. That can make a big bump in your study. You're not going to want to do that if you're doing an update. For the new studies that are done, like the preliminary studies or the full studies for new communities, these long life components are going to be included, and they're going to be included with funding. Although you can do one of the other two also. But the next is, and I've underlined the 2 of these because these go together, to the addition of the long life components with funding at the time they fall within that 30-year window. So the 30-year window is still there as a guide that you can use. So the study would show all the components now would be added that fall within that 30 years and be funded, which is kind of the way we do it now. But in addition to that, the study would show components that fall outside of that 30-year window, but they show 0 funding at this time. But then the association can see and know that these things are going to have to be added in the future. So it's kind of going back to the 30-year rule, but taking out the 30-year rule, primarily related to communities that are older, that have been existing for a while, because we don't want this to be a big jump in funding, although you can do it. But at the same time, we need to recognize the long life components. So the 30-year rule is gone with a little asterisk next to it. The next thing is, um, in the old standards, generally you're replacing what's there with something that matches it. Now it's very clear that without doing considered as an upgrade, because then it's considered a capital improvement and it shouldn't be included in the reserve study. It's very clear that if there are things that you want to substitute for of what's something that's there, for example, if you have a wood deck and you want to substitute with a Trex deck that's made out of plastic or something, that can be done. If you have a standard piece of equipment and you want to replace with a high efficiency piece of equipment, that can be done. And so in the study, the study should designate within the study that there are options to save money if you were to replace this with vinyl or replace with a higher efficiency piece of equipment, because now we're not just looking at the replacement cost of the component, but we're looking at the connection of that component to preventive maintenance or to energy costs. So for example, if you have a wood deck with a 15-year life and you can replace it with a hardy or with some kind of plastic deck and now it has a 50-year life, it may cost you slightly more to do the replacement. From a life cycle cost basis on an annual basis, it could be a lot less, and it could require less maintenance. So the reserve study provider should be taking a look at this now and making notes in the study with recommendations to you of things you should consider. The standards do not say that the reserve provider should come up with all these alternatives and do it, but they should just identify as an opportunity and not quantify it. The one thing I mentioned here is there's a great website. I mentioned all my webinars, dsireusa.org. If you go to that website, you're going to get a map of the United States. It'll tell you every energy incentive rebate that's available in the country by just clicking on that state. All right, what about the reduction of maintenance? Same thing. I talked about this already, that here, this is one, the picture, wood decking, composite decking, and I mentioned that already. All right, there's also the question is, the reserve study standards previously were based on only things you can see. This is a big change, especially for high rises, because there are certain things behind walls that you cannot see that are common elements that will require replacement. Now the studies say you do need to take that into account. So for example, if we're doing a high-rise building, how do we do it? Because we can't see it and the drawings may not even be available to see what's behind the walls. You have to add some type of contingency to the study for unseen components. If you're in let's say a condo development that's made up of townhouses, but you have a big clubhouse, there are things behind the wall in the clubhouse that may need to be replaced, such as plumbing lines or things in the wall, that now they should be accounted for in the reserve study. This directly relates to the conversation about adequacy, again, because if you go down to baseline and say that's adequate, it's ignoring things that are behind the walls that you can't see. So there's a direct connection. So how do you do it? For example, in my office, what we're going to be doing, and we've actually started doing, is for things that are behind the walls that you can't see, we're taking a percentage of the total replacement cost. For a high rise, it may be 10%. For a townhouse community, that's like I talked about with just a clubhouse, it may be 5%, whatever it is. But we're going to recommend or include, based on a percentage of the total replacement cost, a line item for things you cannot see. So clearly, this could result in higher funding requirements, but it reduces the likelihood of there being a special assessment when something happens. This is a big change that you have to take into account, things you cannot see that are there. And this book that was put out by CAI, it's called Breaking Points. You can download it, it's free. It talks about examining aging infrastructure and community associations, and it talks about buildings across the country that did not fund things that you could not see, especially in high rises. They broke down how to be replaced, and there was no money to do it. So there's clearly historical information that shows the problem you can run into because of the unseen items, unseen components. All right, supplementary reports. This is the connection between structure and preventive maintenance. That when the new study says, the new standards say that there are supplementary reports that need to be referenced. There's two of them. There's one on preventive maintenance and one structural integrity. If it needs to be structural integrity based on the type of buildings I talked about, the type of structures, the cost of that should be included in the study. It's a direct inclusion. But one of the disclosures that has to be made is that when we're doing a reserve study, ask the client, do you budget for preventive maintenance? If the answer is no, Here's what needs to take place. If we had a 20-year life on a component, there's a lot of factual information out there that the useful lives of components are reduced if you do not maintain them. So the reserve provider needs to take into account, if you're not doing preventive maintenance, and possibly reduce the useful life of your components to reflect the fact that you're not maintaining it. If you are maintaining it, then all the full useful lives would be used. It's not up to us as a reserve provider to evaluate what you're doing for preventive maintenance. It's just all we need to do is ask, are you doing it or not doing it? And if you're not doing it, what's the impact on the remaining useful lives of the components? This obviously can have a direct relationship to the cost of funding of the reserves, how much you should fund the reserves. I'm going to get into in a few minutes, what does it actually cost you to do preventive maintenance? Because a lot of people panic and they say, if I have to pay for preventive maintenance, everything's going to go up. And I don't care if the useful lives are less and different things like that. But I'm going to show you in a few minutes that preventive maintenance actually will cost you less, not cost you more. But this has to be disclosed within the reserve study. The inclusion of non-cyclical replacements. It used to be that the only things on a reserve study is something that would cyclically require being replaced. A roof every 20 years, sidewalks every 30 years, whatever it is. Now it's very specific that in some cases you have to fix something, and if you fix it once, you don't have to fix it again. It's non-cyclical, it's a one-time thing, and it's known as corrective maintenance, which I'll talk about in a second. But non-cyclical things are okay to be included on the reserve study, in the reserve study. Again, it could result in an increase in funding. Now, guidelines for inclusion of structural. Again, I mentioned certain types of structures, the costly integrity inspection should be included. It's multi-family, this is the general guideline. Multi-family residential buildings with concrete, load-bearing masonry, steel or hybrid structural systems, blah, 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 should have structural integrity inspections done. This is based on CAI's public policy. It's based on the results of the collapse of Champlain Towers in Florida. There's all kinds of information. I'd be happy to share it, anything you need, but it essentially says that buildings that are less than 20 years old, they should have a structural integrity inspection done a maximum of every 10 years. If it's more than 20 years, it should be every 5 years. So the cost of those inspections should be included in your reserve study. So also the cost of corrective maintenance as a result of these studies, which ties into the non-cyclical. For example, if we go out and we look and your structural integrity report says that something should be fixed within the next 3 or 4 years, it's only going to need to be fixed once, but that non-cyclical thing should be included in the reserve study. So if you're having structural integrity inspections done, we are going to ask you as a community to provide us with a copy of your structural integrity report so we can incorporate anything that needs to be fixed in the reserve study. I'm covering a lot of stuff here, and I told you this is kind of some advanced level stuff, but it's all pretty important stuff, especially for certain types of buildings. So again, the periodic structurals and corrective maintenance should be included in the reserve study, could result in an increase of funding. Updating the reserve study. I mentioned this before, how frequently it should be done. The standards now say that the cost for updating the reserve study should be included in the reserve study. What's happened for many, many years is that there's no line in your budget for updating the reserve study. So what will happen is you'll have in there a line each year for management costs, for accounting costs, all this kind of stuff. But there was no placeholder for updating the reserve study, which is absolutely critical. So now, for example, if we do a reserve study that says it should be updated in 3 years, and by the way, one of the requirements is that in the study, it should make a recommendation on when the next update should take place. But if we say it should be updated in 3 years, the reserve study should include the cost of updating that study in 3 years. So you're paying for it on an annual basis, but then it's in your budget and it's like a tickler file to say in 3 years, it's time to update the reserve study, and you do have the money for doing it. So the cost of the reserve study should be included, and it could result in an increase of funding, but the cost of reserve studies as compared to the total replacement costs within the reserve study is minimal. But that should be included, and we do include them now. Preparer qualifications. The preparer qualifications, just as an overall, is that CAI has a reserve study designation. It's called the reserve specialist. We recommended that it's recommended that somebody who has RS designation be the one who does the study. I will tell you, most of the statutory requirements I'm involved in and the banking requirements, Fannie Mae, Freddie, and insurance company requirements say that the reserve studies that they require should be done in conformance with CAI standards. They all say that. But they say that the qualifications of the preparer should be an RS or equivalent. So you see here, other qualifications may include a professional carries national recognized professional credentials. There's only one or two other organizations, one I can think of that has additional APRA guidelines for qualifications for preparers, but I will tell you none of them, because I know them all, are as comprehensive as CAI's RS requirements and CAI's reserve study requirements. CAI is really ahead of the curve on this by updating this, no question about it. Standard of care, nobody should do a reserve study that is not qualified for that building, essentially, that's it. For example, if somebody came to me and said, I want you to do a reserve study on a power plant in my community, we don't have the expertise to do that. And the standard of care is that we should say so, and we should bring in a consultant for doing that. For example, we've done that in the past. We've done very large reserve studies, and in one case, there was a power plant. So we brought in an expert that included in our fee to do that part of it. But the standard of care is that you shouldn't do anything that you're not capable of doing. I mean, it's nice to say, but not everybody does that. So the maintenance challenge. Now let's talk about the connection of maintenance, because there's a direct relationship. And the other thing that CAI did was they said in the National Reserve Study Standard, you have to identify preventive maintenance and also you have to identify structural. So what did CAI do? They came out with a best practice report just recently. It's called Community Association Maintenance and How to Develop a Maintenance Plan. If you want a copy of this, let me know. We'll send you a copy. I was involved in developing this, and it directly relates to putting together a preventive maintenance plan. So this is the maintenance challenge. It's interesting, a couple of things. If you look at communities across the country, most of them don't get involved in preventive maintenance, but they do get involved in reserves. And so it's interesting that now it's changing. The other thing is there's three types of maintenance to know about. Preventive maintenance, which is the big one, a proactive plan to maintain things so they attain their full useful life. Keep in mind that also includes ongoing periodic inspections to look at it. That's part of a preventive maintenance plan. There's deferred maintenance where you do nothing. Now it's interesting because if you look at a lot of the budgets and things around the country, people put in their budget deferred maintenance with a dollar amount. The term deferred has been used in place of preventive for many, many years without stepping back and saying, doesn't deferred mean we're not doing it, while preventive means we are? And I have to tell you that for a while we did that too, because the industry standard was to do deferred maintenance plans. It's a preventive maintenance plan. Deferred means you're not doing it. Corrective maintenance means that if you don't do preventive maintenance and you have to fix something, that's called corrective maintenance. That's the third type of maintenance. Big difference in cost between preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance. So the logic is, if you do preventive maintenance, you won't have corrective maintenance. If you don't do maintenance and you do deferred maintenance, you will have corrective maintenance because you're not maintaining it. So they're all connected, as you can see. So maintenance planning, it's a plan that comes out with the inspections, what's preventive maintenance and budget for it, and a maintenance program is the actual implementation of doing this. This is how it's defined in that new best practices report. What is life cycle cost? I want to say this because it connects to some of the things I'm going to say now. Life cycle cost is how much it's going to cost you over the life cycle of your community to replace things, to maintain things, the cost of energy and all this kind of stuff as it relates to the physical assets. So it's over the life of the community, not just over the next couple of years. And the reason why the term life cycle cost is very important is because if you do some of the things that we're talking about, people think that it's going to include their costs. It may include it in the short term, but in the long term, it will reduce your life cycle costs, which you run into a problem with community associations because the average that somebody lives in a community association is about 7 years across the country. So people say, I'm not going to do maintenance because it's going to cost me now. I don't care about life cycle costs in the future. I won't be living here. That's why a lot of the statutory requirements are now requiring preventive maintenance plans, that you do them to protect the people living in the future. So that's what life cycle costs. Now it's very interesting from a cost perspective. Is this going to jump to the next slide? From a cost perspective, the cost of preventive maintenance is estimated at about 5% of your replacement costs. So let's say you have a 30-year funding plan. The cost of replacing everything in that 30-year funding plan, everything is 5% of $1 million or $50,000 or whatever it is. Take that $50,000, divide it by 30 years, and that's an estimated cost for preventive maintenance, 5%. It's an estimate, every association change, but if you look at this article in Building Operating Magazine, there's been some studies done, and it's about 5%. But if you don't maintain it and have to do corrective maintenance, at the time that you do it, it generally costs at least 30 times the cumulative cost of the preventive maintenance. So if you're setting aside $5 a year for preventive maintenance, over 10 years, that's $50. If you don't do the preventive maintenance, take that $50 and multiply times at least 30, and that's the cost of fixing something if you don't do preventive maintenance. So you can see how, from a life cycle cost perspective, the cost of doing preventive maintenance is significantly less than the cost of fixing something because you do not do it. Everybody is afraid of the cost of preventive maintenance, but if you look at it this way, you'll see that you have to do it because it'll save you money. So that's the life cycle cost, very important. If you do a well-implemented preventive maintenance plan, can typically result in cost savings ranging from 15 to 30% of the total life cycle cost. Big difference. And it can result, and the effect on the reserve study can result in lower life cycle costs. So, and I talked about before, preventive maintenance, you're using the full useful lives instead of reduced useful lives. So here's a quick check you could do with your budget. Take your reserve study and add 5% to the total replacement costs, divide it by the number of years of your study, and use the full useful lives. Or don't add that 5% a year and reduce all your useful lives by 15%. Take the total over 30 years and see which one is cheaper. That's one of the things I think we might start doing in our studies if you don't have preventive maintenance, show you the life cycle cost savings. And when I say you reduce useful lives by 15%, that's a good number. That's a higher number than it should be, because mechanical equipment, if you don't do preventive maintenance, usually the useful lives are reduced by 40%. So, but that's just a guideline to show you. So here's an example. This is a high-rise building that we actually did a reserve study for. And we said, okay, without preventive maintenance, it's $33,849,000 that they're accumulating over 30 years. With preventive maintenance, it's $31 million. So they can save $2 million over 30 years by implementing preventive maintenance, just based on what I just showed you. The thing that this doesn't include that makes it even worse if you don't do preventive maintenance, this is just reduction in useful life, not 30 times the cost of fixing it, which would make this $2 million much, much higher. So this is just an example of how the advantage of preventive maintenance is over life cycle cost, and the connection now that in the reserve studies, it's directly connected to preventive maintenance and why it's done. So now the big question everybody's waiting for: what does adequate mean? What does adequacy mean for your association? I'll start out by saying every association's definition of adequacy will be different. Adequacy in the past was believed to mean that if you're using a baseline study, as I said before, baseline funding, where you take all your components, let them drop down to zero, and that is adequate. That's adequate for you. Now, it still may be adequate for you, but then maybe you should update the study every year. But the things that it leaves out is adequate. It leaves out things you can't see. So you may think you're fully adequate, but it's leaving out things you can't see because they're behind the walls that may require replacement. So effect on the reserve study, it's, I spelled this wrong. I'm missing an I. It's your level of adequacy is based on your funding plan evaluation, how you look at your funding plan, which I'll go into in a second. It may not mean baseline funding, and the result could be an increase in funding if you start incorporating things. These are the funding plan. Oh, why is it skipping? These are the funding plans we have, and they're listed in the standards in order of greatest risk to most conservative. Baseline funding is the greatest risk, clearly, because if something costs $1 more, you're going to run into a deficit. If it needs to be replaced a year early, you're going to run into a deficit. If it's something that's not included on the study, you're going to run into a deficit. If it's something you can't see that was not included in the study, you're going to run into a deficit. Full funding, like I said before, it's 100% funding. In many, many instances, that's overfunding because you have so much money sitting there for a long period of time that you're never going to use. So the question of adequacy for you is based on threshold funding and what you set your threshold at. Now, here's a little graphical thing because it just shows It just shows again the exact same thing. Baseline funding is the most risky, full funding is most conservative. So let's look at how you develop a funding plan, because this will help you come up with your adequacy. You start out with one component, it's replaced, you go down to zero. This is the only time in a funding plan that it's full funding and baseline funding at the same time, because it's only one component. You have to go up to full funding so you have enough money. And when you place it, you go down to zero. Full funding, baseline funding at the same time. But that's not reality. But this is what you're starting at. You take that, now you add up all the components in your community. They all have different useful lives, different replacement costs, and this is what they all look like. If you put them together as individual components, then you add them all together and you come up with the model that I talked about before, which is full funding. And this thing's moving without me pushing the buttons right now. You come up with full funding, you come up with baseline funding, and then the question is that circle or that oval is what is adequate funding and what do you look at? Why is this doing this? Just when I don't want it to do it. So the things to look at when making your decision in regards to adequate funding are, do you do preventive maintenance? If you don't do preventive maintenance, you shouldn't go down to zero and you should adjust the useful life. How often do you plan on updating the study? If you update the study every year, maybe you'll feel comfortable going closer to baseline because you're updating it every year. What type of funding plans you use? Talked about it a second ago. The banking requirement, because it's not just what you say. For example, if you go to Fannie and Freddie in regards to mortgages, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. What they say right now is that to them, adequate funding means you're setting aside 10% of your annual budget towards reserves, and that's considered adequate funding for them. Keep in mind that it's wrong. They know it's wrong because 10% of your annual budget is not connected at all to the common elements you have in your community at all. And I don't even know where they came with the 10%. I don't think they know where they came up with the 10%. But you can have a building with $1 billion worth of assets and one with no common elements right next to each other, the same annual budget, because one has a lot of parties and one has a lot of common elements, and 10% of their annual budget is the same, but they're both wrong. So I will tell you that I've been involved with Fannie and Freddie. They are changing their requirements, and you'll see them coming out sometime in the future. It's a political thing, so it may be in the distant future, but their reserve funding requirements are going to be somehow connected to the physical components in your community rather than just tied into your annual budget. I will tell you that HUD does something now, which is very interesting, because there are HUD reserve studies for HUD communities, and they base it on, I think it's 0.006% of the insurance appraised value for replacement cost of your community. So they actually tie it into the common element or the physical assets. But from an adequacy perspective, it's 10%. You may look at your reserve study, and I would suggest that you do look at your reserve study. If you're setting aside less than 10% of your annual budget, set aside 10% so you don't run into problems when people are refinancing or buying in your community if it's a Fannie or Freddie loan. All right, what is your current fund status? For example, if you're setting aside, take a look at that for adequacy. I mean, like I said, 100% is too high, but 10% is too low. So take a look at what your fund status is. In what years do you have large expenditures? I like to take a look when you're doing the cash flow projection and say, okay, we dropped down to, let's say, $50,000. Is that adequate? Our biggest component that ever requires replacement may be $100,000. And you may make the decision from a risk perspective that you'll never go below the cost of your most expensive component to fix, because if it has to be replaced early, you want to make sure you always have enough money to do it. Also, the other thing about unseen components coming up with adequacy, but you can see that there's no way I can sit here and tell you what adequate is for your association. Some people use the guideline that my adequacy is 5% of my total replacement costs, and I'll never go below that, or 10% of my total replacement costs, and I'll never go below that. And that's okay to do because you'll never get to a baseline. So that's another way to look at it, but you really have to evaluate everything together. Because we've had communities, by the way, who've said, we want our threshold for adequacy to be 5% of our total replacement cost. So that's their way of doing it. And we talk about reserve funding policies for communities. Your reserve funding policy for your community may say, we never want our reserves to drop below 5% of the total replacement cost. So you set a policy for doing that, but that's how you evaluate it. All right, now, the other thing, and I'm just about done because I have 3 minutes, not bad timing, is that there are statutory requirements that are connected to this in terms of setting your adequacy. Uh, Everybody here, I think, if you're not from New Jersey, let me know. But everybody here, I think, is from New Jersey. In New Jersey right now, what it says is when a developer creates a new community, the developer has to include in their initial budget a preliminary reserve studies that is adequately funded. So like I said before, most developers, every one of them I've ever seen uses full funding. What this Senate Bill 2760 does is it changes that to say that the developer also has to include a maintenance plan, how much it's going to cost for the maintenance plan, and they must fund the maintenance plan while they're in control the same way they fund the reserves. The problem that in the state of New Jersey, which this legislation is going to fix, is that right now, as soon as the developer is gone, there's no requirement at all for the association to fund their reserves. So what happens is, this is the process. The developer sets up a study, the developer funds it, then as part of the transition report, the developer gets sued for underfunding the reserves, then the association takes control and they don't fund the reserves. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy, but that's the kind of thing that happens. But the new 2760 requires that the associations, after they take control, fund the reserves and have reserve studies done, and they define what adequacy is. Adequacy in the state of New Jersey, it's a little stale, and there's a little conflict because it says that the study should be done in conformance with the latest edition of the CAI standards. I told you what they say in terms of adequacy, but they go on to say adequacy is never going below zero, only including components with a useful life of 30 years or less, except for roofs. If a roof has a life of more than 30 years, it should be included. So it doesn't necessarily, not necessarily directly in sync with what the national standards say, but that definition of adequacy in New Jersey is from a few years ago. But that's what it says. It also says that you have to include maintenance. You have to include maintenance. So you have to update not only the reserve study, but the maintenance plan also. So it's a good solution to a problem that's been created in this state because it's going to require it. If you look around the country, these are the states that have statutory requirements. It's interesting. Blue states have a reserve study and funding requirement. Greens have a guidance for reserves, but don't have statutory requirements. And the other ones do not have statutory guidance or statutory requirements. It's changing big time. I mean, for example, the state of Maryland just came out with a reserve study requirement. Delaware has a reserve study requirement. So it's changing because of, I mean, I hate to say, the tragedy in Florida has brought about some great stuff across the country. And I just want to show you also, you know, we talk about reserves, we talk about maintenance, we talk about all this stuff, but what's the connection between them? Here's an example. This is a building that has a podium deck. The podium deck is across here and it covers a parking garage underneath and the structure. So the podium deck has a membrane, and the podium deck membrane and the decking are included in the reserve study. So if you don't maintain it, what happens? It's going to have to be replaced sooner than you anticipated, but also water will get through and rot out the structure underneath. So this shows the connection between reserves, maintenance, and the structure, because as soon as that structure, which is not on the reserve study, starts getting rusted away because you're not maintaining the podium deck, it's going to cost the association millions of dollars to fix it that they didn't anticipate and they could have avoided if they would have done preventive maintenance. So what do? You integrate together reserves with the preventive maintenance plan, energy with energy cost reduction evaluations, because if you have a lot of mechanical equipment, I promise you that if you add the cost of energy and go to a higher efficiency piece of equipment, the savings in energy will more than offset the additional cost for the higher efficiency piece of equipment, and there's incentives out there that will help you even more. Structural safety with periodic inspections, the result is, you know, there's connections. It's going to maximize your property values, it's going to minimize your life cycle costs, and it's going to help you maintain a safe community. When evaluating adequacy, take into account the funding plan used, unseen components, and implementation of preventive maintenance. You should never get a reserve study from a company like mine or anybody and not go over the study and just take the report and accept it. I think the best thing you should do is tell the person who's doing a reserve study, before you issue the report as final, give me the numbers as a draft. Let's sit down and go over it and come out with a plan that works for our community. I will tell you that Stu knows this. You know, in my firm we have a software program where you can actually get into the program and make adjustments on your own study in a password protected portal. And a lot of clients like that. It's evolving. It's pretty much there, but we do that. So what do? You integrate together. You must also review your funding options. Just pointing this out again, because the funding options are how you develop your adequacy. And then the result again is maximum property values, life cycle cost, and safety in your community. And I did it at 10:32, but we didn't start until 9:33. So I'm good. And there's a question in the chat. Let's see. Oh, if you'd like a CEU certificate, just ask, email Jody in my office. But there's a bunch of people here. So now, does anybody have any questions about anything I said or anything I didn't say that I should have said? Nick, you just popped up here. Did you just get here, or you want us to see you now? Nick, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I've been in for half an hour, Mitch, but I didn't get there at the beginning.
You missed the best part.
That's what I figured, but I was going to ask for the slides and the references. So
yeah, we'll send
to make up for it.
Yeah, we'll send out a copy of the presentation to everybody. Anybody have any questions? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or, as usual, there were about 50 people that signed up, about high 20s, 26, 27 showed up. Any questions? Stu, no questions? Are you on your sailboat? I see the water behind you.
I wish I was.
Well,
this is a very good overview, and I believe we just engaged your firm to do a study for us.
Oh, great. Great, I appreciate it. And like I said, when you get to the point, ask us to give you the numbers before we finalize your report, because what we can do is we can do a Zoom call like this and make adjustments, and you can see in real time changes to the projections and come up with adequate funding. And keep in mind also that if you're very underfunded and you have to start out with baseline funding, that doesn't mean you have to stay there. You can go from baseline to threshold to full funding, do whatever you want, but there's nothing that says you have to stay there. The other thing, by the way, what it says in New Jersey in the statutes is that if you're not adequately funded and it doesn't affect 10% of your overall budget, then you have 2 years to catch up. If you are underfunded based on the definition of adequacy, where it causes your annual budget for the entire community to go up 10% or more, you have 10 years to catch up. But you do need to catch up to adequacy. So that's coming, I think. I've had the opportunity to meet with a lot of senators because I'm on the political action committee in Black in New Jersey. And I will tell you, for whatever it's worth, it's restored my faith in the political system after meeting with every one of these people as sharp as a tack. So don't read the papers. Yes, Nick, your hand is up.
Yes, sir. So when we've been talking about adequacy, but the recommendation we seem to get from our reserve study firm is that we hold 10% of the value of our reserve projects or components, I guess would be the better way to say that, as a reserve against unexpected contingencies.
That was in minute 27 of the presentation, but some people.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I think that's a perfectly valid way to do it, because some people say let's make our threshold 5% of the total, 10% of the total, whatever it is. But that's an acceptable way to do it. I do think you also need to review the study with them to talk about how often you update the study and things like that. But in some cases, you may find that 10% is conservative, because keep in mind what 10% means is you're setting aside 10% of everything when the most expensive component you'll ever have to replace may be only 3%. So, you don't want to overfund. You really got to be careful. So it's overfunding and underfunding that you have to take a look at. And I would guess that 10% is on the conservative side.
Okay, they range from 10 to 20. What they say is when you hit 20%, quit doing that. We never get there, but that's another story. So,
but keep in mind, are you funding for unseen components? Do you use preventive maintenance? I mean, there's other things that come into play here now, so you really need to take a look at everything. And if the person that's doing it is an RS and that they're familiar with the national standards, then they should be asking these questions and guiding you, no question about it. And
thank you.
If they're not, call us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, hey, I will.
Anybody else have any questions or anything? No? Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. And feel free to email me at any time with any questions. Go through Jody, whatever you like. And it's been a pleasure. So have a great day, everybody. And this is recorded and it'll be posted on our website also if you want to refer it to anybody. Thanks.
Hey, Mitch.
Take care, everybody.